Hello, I'm Bobby Donaldson, Professor of History, Director of the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, and an Archon in the Alpha Iota member boule of the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. On behalf of our center and our university, I would like to welcome you to this virtual retrospective commemorating the 150th birthday of our founder, Archon Henry McKee Minton. Archon Minton was born in Columbia, South Carolina on December 25th of 1871. His family were deeply connected to the city of Columbia. His father was a graduate of our university, receiving his law degree in 1876. Among those who graduated with Archon Theophilus Minton was Archon Richard T. Greener. Today on our campus, there is a large statue recognizing Richard T. Greener's important role at the University of South Carolina and this nation. In this virtual retrospective, you will learn much more about the Minton family in Columbia. You will learn about their journey from Columbia to Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. But you'll also learn more about the period of Reconstruction and why there needs to be much more research and investigation of this critical period in American history. On behalf of our university and on behalf of the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, thank you for being with us.
Good evening. I'm Dwayne Murray, the Grand Sire Archon of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. I wish to welcome you and to thank you for joining us for this virtual retrospective on the life and career of Henry McKee Minton, the guiding light and founder of our fraternity in 1904. Archon Minton was born in Columbia, South Carolina in December 1871. So this retrospective rightfully commemorates Archon Minton's birth 150 years ago. One of our historians, the distinguished John Hope Franklin, once said, "We must go beyond textbooks, go out into the bypaths and untrodden depths of the wilderness and travel and explore and tell the world of the glories of our journey." This virtual retrospective on Archon Minton goes beyond the textbooks. It shows newly discovered information and tells the world about Minton's extraordinary journey. Thank you and enjoy this remarkable program.
I'm Archon Daryl Searcy, Sire Archon of the Southeast region of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. On behalf of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, I welcome you to this documentary on our founder, Henry McKee Minton. This year, we mark the 150th birthday celebration of our founder, Henry McKee Minton, here in Columbia, South Carolina. At this historic home, the following program shows the history of our founder, Henry McKee Minton, how he founded Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, gathered with 5 additional men, 5 professionals, and how they entered into their very first boule meeting in Philadelphia in 1904. We will also join in a toast in celebration of Henry Minton's 150th birthday. I hope you enjoy the documentary, and we look forward to seeing you in the very near future. Thank you.
Be it resolved that a society be organized for the purpose of binding men of like qualities into a close, sacred, fraternal union, that they may know the best of one another, and that each in this life
may, to the best of his ability, aid the other, and through concerted action, bring about those things that seem best for all, that cannot be achieved by individual effort.
The Sigma Pi Phi fraternity was founded on May 15, 1904. The turn of the 20th century was a dramatic moment for African Americans in this country. It was a moment of promise and also a moment of great adversity. So the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity is formed within years of the Atlanta Exposition in 1895, where Booker T. Washington makes a major address that many have called the Atlanta Compromise. During that Atlanta Compromise event, several people who later become archons were present, including a man named John Hope, who later becomes the president of Morehouse College, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 writes the book, The Souls of Black Folk. So The Souls of Black Folk is published 1 year before the founding of Sigma Pi Phi. And in The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois talks about the problem of the 20th century. And he says the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. And in so many respects, that is exactly what motivated someone like Henry McKee Minton to establish Sigma Pi Phi. Here were men of prominence, here were men of achievement who still combated and confronted the color line. And the fraternity's mission have been ways to offer protection and space for those individuals who were confronted by the color line, but also a space for people who would fight the color line in this country.
Separate but equal is the doctrine of the day. Discrimination is at its height. Racism is at its height. There was limited opportunities for African Americans. There were a number of race riots throughout the nation. And it was a period of, I won't say great unrest, but it was also a period of great creativity because a number of our professional organizations were founded during this early part of the 1900s. So there was a recognition of, well, we'll do it ourselves, that businesses and business bureaus, NAACP, the Urban League, the National Business Association, all of these organizations became active during that first part of the 1900s. So while we were restricted because of the Plessy decision of so-called separate but equal, there was also a determination to move ahead. And move ahead we did.
The fact that Henry Minton and other African-American men in a similar position are able to start Sigma Pi Phi is really an important moment, but also a moment that we can trace back as we see African-American men and women coming together in different ways to support their social, intellectual, and cultural growth. So social and fraternal organizations have been really important to people of African descent. We can think back to the Prince Hall Masons, of which there was an important chapter in Philadelphia. We can think about right after the Civil War, the burgeoning of the Ugly Fishing Club and other social and civic-minded organizations for elite upper-class African-American men and women who are also starting their own organizations. So as more African-American men are able to move into these professional organizations, they are, again, thinking about the networks that they can create, times and moments where they can be social without having to think about race, where they can continue to meet with like-minded individuals who may have similar backgrounds in terms of family, status, education.
Henry McKee Minton's vision of a fraternity of African American men came to life in Philadelphia in 1904.
Henry McKee Minton was a very talented observer of historical trends. He was aware of a small but growing number of professional men in the city of Philadelphia, indeed, I would say throughout the nation. Howard University and Harry were both producing black doctors. There were many African Americans who had gone to graduate school and had earned advanced degrees. But they were basically isolated in the city of Philadelphia. As a pharmacist, he was aware of the small but growing number of physicians and dentists, a handful of lawyers. He was aware of their isolation because they depended on the African American community for their support, and they actually lived not far from those African American communities within the city of Philadelphia. But he was aware that this isolation was not a very healthy atmosphere in which they could grow. And so I think he recognized that if he could provide a means for them to come together, to be supportive of each other, to socialize together in ways that would stimulate their progressive growth, that would be a very desirable activity.
The gathering of 6 men, or archons as they're called in Sigma Pi Phi, carefully grew.
It was and still is the preeminent organization of African American men. It is the only graduate fraternity in the world. It is a fraternity in which men are invited into membership. And it contains, I would say, the most illustrious African American men in the world. Let's just think for a second about who were some of the members of this fraternity. Well, of course, there was Martin Luther King, Jr., there was W.E.B. Du Bois, there was Charles R. Drew, there was Percy L. Julian, there was Ralph J. Bunch, there was John Hope Franklin, there was William H. Hasty, there was Vernon E. Jordan. The list goes on and on and on. Sigma Pi Phi fraternity has had in its membership and continues to have in its membership individuals who are leaders in the struggle for civil rights and social justice, leaders who are concerned with enhancing political empowerment and economic empowerment. It was a fraternity in which men were bound together, in which there was a concerted effort to provide assistance and help to African American communities. This is an organization that supports each other, but is firmly committed to enhancing the existence of African Americans in this nation and throughout the world.
Sigma Pi Phi is one of the significant achievements of Henry McKee Minton, and yet it is one in a remarkable life. Henry Cato McKee Minton was born in 1871 in South Carolina. As his father and mother worked with a cadre of people immediately after the Civil War to reconstruct government in the American South. That Reconstruction was built on the foundation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution that eliminated slavery, barred discrimination, and established voting rights for African American men. Reconstruction raised the possibility of real democracy for the millions of newly free African Americans. Born in the midst of Reconstruction, South Carolina, Henry Minton's life, his family's journey, his unwavering ambitions, and his persistent determination open a window to a past that has much to show America.
Reconstruction is a period that follows the American Civil War. South Carolina is a unique space to study Reconstruction. The first shots fired in the American Civil War take place at Fort Sumter near Charleston in 1861. The path of the Civil War comes through South Carolina. In February of 1865, much of the city of Columbia is devastated by fires during Sherman's march from the sea. It comes to Columbia in 1865. Much of the city is decimated as a result. And Reconstruction becomes a moment of rebuilding. It becomes a moment of reconnecting the country. And South Carolina plays a critical role in this experiment.
South Carolina, particularly Columbia, was essentially the epicenter for Reconstruction. It was a very progressive city at the time, very progressive state. The northern troops, a lot of northern troops, a lot of Union soldiers was here protecting the rights of the freed slaves, enabling them to vote. South Carolina's state legislature was dominated by African Americans because they were able to vote. So they controlled the state legislature.
Well, South Carolina, and this surprises a lot of people, by all standards of the time, was a very progressive state. In fact, others came to really participate in what was going on here. The University of South Carolina was the first school of higher education in the South to be integrated. So this was a pretty progressive state. We had at least 2 African Americans that served as lieutenant governor. Our Secretary of State, state treasurer, were African Americans. And some of them came to South Carolina to participate in this newfound freedom for people of color.
Henry's father traveled south from Philadelphia in 1869 after receiving his diploma from the Institute for Colored Youth, later Cheyney University. The son of a famed Philadelphia caterer, Theophilus, or T.J. Minton, moves to Charleston as a single man to direct and teach in a church-affiliated school for newly free people.
So when we think about why free African Americans in the North might want to move south, we know that they feel very strongly connected to the greater African American community. And so that feeling of connection persists. Once we get through emancipation, this desire doesn't stop, it just changes, right? Again, they are the ones in the position to, they have money, they have connections, they feel very strongly about the need to uplift, in the words that many of them use, the race. And as part of that, they seek to live and work in the South among formerly enslaved and free African Americans.
Almost everybody who went to the Institute for Colored Youth was influenced there politically. There were political elements among the teachers. When I say political, I mean equal rights, suffrage, all the good stuff, the good things were happening there. So they were able to have friends and colleagues. Their teachers were imparting things to them. They were moving from one stage to another because the war was ending. Things were going to be different, and they had their sights and their intentions as they were graduating and moving out of there. And so many of them came back to South Carolina.
It was not altogether given what would happen and what would be the success and the achievements of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 called for states to approve the 14th Amendment, an amendment outlining what it means to be a citizen, and it also called for states to put forward new state constitutions. By the spring of 1868, African Americans are motivated. They are beginning to be organized, and they're beginning to map out strategies to aid in the transition from slavery to freedom. And some call the 1868 Constitution of South Carolina a radical constitution. And when you look closely at what happens in South Carolina, there are radical consequences of that Constitution. You see an entire cadre of African Americans who are elected to the General Assembly of South Carolina, who are later elected to Congress in South Carolina. And in that Constitution, it states that all schools which receive public money should be open to all citizens without regard to race. Now that is a radical proposition in this country, and most certainly in South Carolina, and it has dramatic consequences.
Within a year, T.J. Minton moves to Columbia and gets involved with city government. Evidently satisfied with his prospects, T.J. Minton returns to Philadelphia in November 1870 to marry Virginia McKee, the daughter of a Philadelphia real estate investor who was thought to be the wealthiest African American man in the nation. The newlyweds returned to South Carolina, and early in 1871, T.J. Minton shifts careers from education to government, taking a position as a clerk in the state Senate.
Henry McKee Minton is really named after his grandfathers. His maternal grandfather was McKee, who was a Civil War hero, a very prominent landowner, owned property in all over Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, and in Maryland. He had two daughters. One was Virginia Martha, who married Theophilus, who was the son of Henry's grandfather, whose name was Henry. He is actually named after his two grandparents, Henry McKee Minton, the son of Theophilus. The Mintons in Philadelphia were caterers. There was a group known as the Guild of Caterers who commanded a lot of respect and provided the citizens, that is the black citizens of Philadelphia, with leadership that they otherwise might not have had, because they were in contact with individuals who were key players in the history of Philadelphia politics. Because they were caterers at most of their events, they were able to talk to them, they were able to provide some input into the decisions that they might make regarding the future of our people in the city of Philadelphia.
So when we think about the legacy of the Mintons, and we can think about their connections to a range of politics, from fighting disfranchisement in 1838 to being part of the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, to fighting for the founding of a hospital for African American people to receive treatment, but also to train doctors and nurses. We can think of the Mintons as part of a social community as well. They are very connected to a group of men and women who are considered by many to be the aristocrats of color, right? They have attained a certain social status, and they are growing that community that gets together in social ways, but also to be civic minded. So these social organizations that they're a part of are also thinking about ways that they can uplift the race, ways that they can give and do for people beyond their set. And I think that is part of the important legacy that we might consider when we think about the Minton family.
On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1871, Virginia gives birth to Henry McKee Minton. Months after Henry is born, Jenny buys land in the city center and has a large, stylish house built for the family at 63 East Gervais Street, near the state capitol building.
Henry McKee Minton, born in 1871, for the very first 5 years of his life, is living within the shadows of the State House of South Carolina and literally watching Reconstruction unfold in his early years. And so here's a young man coming of age in South Carolina. His father is a student at the University of South Carolina. His mother is a wealthy landowner and also a prominent member of the Episcopal Church in the city. And he is seeing before his own eyes men and women of great distinction who are beginning to take leadership roles in South Carolina. But they're also part of the reconstruction of the nation. And so he sees that. Now, what's ironic is that Henry Minton is born in December of 1871. This is a moment where you begin to see steps being taken to advance the agenda of Reconstruction. But it's also a moment where you're seeing other citizens of South Carolina who are adamant that the experiment of Reconstruction be thwarted. And so in the very moment, in the very period in which Henry Minton is born, you see an escalation of racial violence. You see an escalation of terrorism. You see an escalation of the assassinations of African-American elected officials. You see African-American citizens being targeted for daring to exercise their right to vote, for daring to claim their rights as citizens. And they're beginning now to testify before Congress about the racial atrocities that they're witnessing. And so the irony is that here you have a prominent, emerging black family who are here in South Carolina to be a part of the Reconstruction experiment, but who are seeing almost from day one that this is an uphill battle in order to see that agenda fully achieved.
The Mintons live within walking distance of work and the University of South Carolina's noted horseshoe of buildings and tree-lined walks. TJ starts a new job in the state treasurer's office with the formidable politician Francis Cardoza. He also studies law with the brilliant Robert Brown Elliott and is admitted to the state bar by the South Carolina Supreme Court. He then enters the college's School of Law to earn a formal degree. For an African-American man, this is an unprecedented event, studying at a public university in the South.
And it's likely that young Henry and his mother and father knew the Rollins sisters, an extraordinary group of African-American women who lived right across the street from the State House. And their home became a destination for public debates about civil rights, public debates about Reconstruction, and public debates about the extension of the right to vote, suffrage, for all people, including women.
They were a part of it, and they were so smart and bright and intense. They looked at what games were being played politically, and they put themselves in the right places at the right time. So being across from the State House was perfect. In between sessions, the lawmakers could come over and have a place to rest, to have a drink, and they could entertain. Well, I think there must have been a sense of camaraderie, between them. I think that there would have been some discussion of strategies. It was all about strategies at that point. Who could be influenced for their causes, for the better good. And as women's talk often had to be about strategies in dealing with men at that time, but it was, in this case, it was dealing with politicians. So I think that could have been a great source of discussion among them. in addition to their children and their homes, running their homes, keeping the men safe. Their fears at the time, keeping the family safe, the safety element, which as we know, got quite severe pretty fast during Reconstruction.
Before Henry reached his 5th birthday in 1876, TJ graduates from law school with an enviable post in government, an elegant house, and a family. Why would a wealthy family with a coveted position in state government, a new house, and a young child abruptly move from South Carolina?
When Henry Minton is 4 years old, in the summer of 1876, his father works in the Treasurer's Office of South Carolina. 1876 was a pivotal election year. And leading up to the election in November, there were a series of incidents of racial violence in South Carolina and around the country.
White supremacists assassinate African American public officials, including state legislators, terrorize and murder voters in their homes, and stage military-style assaults on majority black towns to retake local and state government.
In the summer of 1876, there was a small community in South Carolina called Hamburg, which was a black-led community. And in the summer of 1876, that community is targeted by white vigilantes, known at the time as red shirts. And the red shirt campaign was a calculated campaign to overtake elections, was a calculated campaign to use terror and violence to frighten African-American voters. And in Hamburg, several prominent leaders of the community are killed as a consequence of racial violence. And Hamburg becomes a warning across the state of South Carolina. And so as we talk about voter suppression, the stealing of ballots, that is happening in South Carolina. And so surely Virginia McKee Minton and Theophilus J. Minton begin to sense that the platform in which they live is quite uncertain. Many people are of the mind that Hamburg was a nail in the coffin of Reconstruction, that white citizens of the state understood that the best way to overcome Reconstruction, the best way to redeem white Democrats and white citizens was through violence. And you begin to see a reign of terror in 1876.
That's what that massacre was all about, to overturn an election. Well, there's murder and mayhem. These people were, a lot of them were doing a lot of things to try to cling to political power. They were doing, the reasons they got run out of the state because they were thinking of creative ways in order to hold on to power and to keep other blacks in power.
African Americans consider Columbia the safest city in the state. But even Columbia would not be safe without the presence of United States Army soldiers.
1876 is when literally the plates shifted under our feet. We are literally on a fault line that extends from Charleston all the way through Columbia, and every once in a while you have an earthquake. With the election of 1876 and Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden was defeated, and as part of this grand compromise, the federal troops left the South. The protections that had been in place that allowed us to live up to our God-given potential were aggressively removed, and things began to change very quickly, very quickly. So this I dare not call it an oasis, but certainly this place where we saw in a very short period of time an amazing level of prosperity changed very quickly. I mean, families looking for continued opportunity went other places, and obviously Philadelphia certainly had a history of not only a close connection to South Carolina, but also because of the Society of Friends and Quakers and others, and obviously family ties there. For him, it was a place that at that time in history was better to be than in Columbia, South Carolina, for anyone of color or consequence.
In March 1877, T.J. Minton joins an elite delegation from South Carolina to meet the new President Rutherford B. Hayes, to press the case for maintaining U.S. Army soldiers in South Carolina. The new president refuses their bid, and a month later, 5-year-old Henry, living 2 blocks from the State House, would likely have watched the departure of Army troops from the city.
And they go to Hayes and say, Mr. President, if you pull out troops, that's going to create a space for the return of white Democrats, the redemption of white rule. It will lead to the undermining of everything we've been working toward since the Emancipation Proclamation. And Theophilus Minton, Joseph Rainey, Robert Smalls, Robert Brown Elliott, and others appealed to the president to no avail. And what does that mean? It means that black elected officials are being pushed out of their jobs. It means that Richard T. Greener is fired from his position as professor at the University of South Carolina. It means that students who are enrolled at the University of South Carolina are expelled and must seek their education elsewhere. It means the dismissal of Francis Cardoza, and it means the dismissal of Theophilus Minton. And so as the curtain falls on Reconstruction, the Mintons understand there is no future in Columbia, South Carolina. And so in 1877, Theophilus Minton, Virginia McKee Minton, and young Henry McKee Minton, they pack their bags. They close their office. They rent out their home. And they try to find a new life for themselves in Washington, D.C.
It was mostly the children needed to be protected. There was possibility of work.
In 1877, Washington, D.C. is a hub of African American intellectual, political, and social action. For foundational years of Henry's education, the Mintons select the Howard Academy, the preparatory school on the campus of Howard University, which will come to be known as the capstone of Negro education. After Howard Academy, Henry attends Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, one of the country's top preparatory schools, and he excels.
What led him to Exeter? Well, it was the school that the elite attended. It was a stepping stone to Harvard, to the Ivy Leagues. Exeter is, I will say, notorious in that there were other students of color that attended Exeter, but who did not identify as being African American.
He edits the school yearbook and leads the debating society. He also gains wider notice. A newspaper reports.
The boy is studious, and according to reports, has a most glib tongue, which has won for him the reputation of youthful profundity. He is undoubtedly one of the brightest boys in the school and ranks high in scholarship. He is a ready talker, having figured in one of the debating societies as a leading spirit almost since his entrance in the academy.
At Exeter, Henry earns recognition as the top student, but white Southern students object and attempt to boycott the public ceremony honoring Henry, the only African American student at the school.
The one thing that is not really talked about very much was that Phillips Exeter had a number of fraternities, and by all accounts, he would have been an ideal candidate, except for the fact that the color of his skin kept him from being invited into membership into any of those fraternities. But indeed, he was aware of the camaraderie, the closeness that the members of fraternities enjoyed while he was there, a student at Phillips Exeter.
After graduation in 1891, Henry joins his parents in Philadelphia, who returned to their home city and career as an attorney when the Democratic Cleveland administration removes T.J. Minton from his Treasury Department post in early 1886.
He graduates from Phillips Exeter, and then he travels back to Philadelphia, and he enters the School of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. In the second year, he decided to switch fields and go into pharmacy. So he became a pharmacist, and upon earning his degree in pharmacy, he now becomes the owner of the first drugstore owned by an African American in the city of Philadelphia, and clearly, I would suspect, in the state of Pennsylvania. In addition, he becomes a board member of the Douglas Hospital, which was founded in 1895, and he becomes a secretary of the board of that hospital. He's active, he's smart, he commands respect, and he's, I would say, ambitious, but I won't say not unnecessarily so. I think he had the talent, he had the skills, and he was able to hone those skills to the great benefit of all of the African Americans in the city of Philadelphia.
In 1898, as Henry Minton practices pharmacy, a medical student graduates from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School with honors. But the university and other white-run hospitals in the city refuse him an internship, which is essential for a medical license. Then in 1901, Minton's friend Algernon Jackson earns the first African-American medical degree from Philadelphia's esteemed Jefferson Medical College. But the school also excludes him from internships. Despite the institutional racism, Henry Minton enters Jefferson Medical in 1902. He is just one of 6 doctors trained at the elite school before it again closes its doors to African Americans for decades.
The University of Pennsylvania at that time had a written restriction against African Americans being inducted into predominantly white fraternities. So he, while he had some feeling about fraternities and what they could do or could not do, he himself was not able to become a member of a college fraternity during his whole career.
In Philadelphia, which is a very important center for medicine and education, although people of African descent were able to be treated in different places in the city, that care, when given by white doctors and nurses, was often colored by prejudice and racial science that was part of the learning of the day. So as we move past the Civil War and into the turn of the 20th century, the opportunity for African Americans to have control over their medical care is a really important one.
Beyond that, Henry and his friends recognized the call of W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 for a talented tenth of African Americans to work for the benefit of all. And Minton imagines, as he studies to become one of the fewer than 20 African American doctors in the entire city. Henry seeds the idea in conversations with friends. He calls them together at his home to organize the fraternity on May 15th, 1904.
Now, who were these men? Henry McKee Minton, Algernon Brashear Jackson, who was the first graduate of the Jefferson Medical School, Richard Warwick Jr., who was a dentist, who was a graduate of the Philadelphia School of Dental Surgery, and then there was Edwin Clarence Joseph Turpin Howard, was one of the first of two African-American graduates from the Harvard Medical School. Robert Abel, who was the first African-American graduate from the Hahnemann School of Medicine. And the other person was, of course, Eugene Henson, who was an honors graduate from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School.
Sigma Pi Phi is formed in the spring of 1904. Life was not easy for any African American at the turn of the 20th century in Philadelphia or elsewhere. And so Minton and others understood that the founding of the fraternity was not simply a circle of elite, prominent African American men. It was a safe space where these men could gather socially. It was a safe space for them to engage in debate and intellectual exchange, but it was a safe space in a broader context. It is part of a continuation of African American public spheres. 1 year prior to the founding of Sigma Pi Phi, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who later becomes an archon, publishes his book, The Souls of Black Folk. In this book, he talks about the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line. He also, in this book, speaks about double consciousness, being an American and a person of color, where those two terms don't go together. There is this worrying distinction about on what claims one can make of citizenship. And so the Sigma Pi Phi becomes this space where these types of debates are happening.
Sigma Pi Phi expands gradually, carefully beyond Philadelphia and the fellowship of the original or Alpha Boule.
So the second unit for the fraternity is established through the friendship of Henry and John Otter. In a similar fashion, some of the members in Chicago were also members of had become members of the Niagara movement, and they knew some individuals in the city of Baltimore. And through these friendships, Baltimore becomes the third unit, or the third site of a member boule in the fraternity. And it's through the friendships of the members of each of the units, each of the member boules, with others in other locations, that the fraternity began to grow. So it was by word of mouth, basically. There was nothing that was published about this organization in those early years. It was a secret organization. And it was only known by those individuals who were part of it.
In 1915, at a national gathering of all members, or a grand boule, the archons adopt a resolution to consider the social, economic, and legal problems confronting the people of our race throughout the country, and particularly in the cities containing boules, and finding a solution to the problem. Henry Minton works widely for equality in all aspects of life as a member of the American Negro Historical Society, Booker T. Washington's Negro Business League, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP.
He devoted his life to helping others. He became one of the founders of Mercy Hospital. But what's interesting about the Mercy Hospital was it was founded by all Archons.
In 1921, Minton's friend, fellow Archon, and medical colleague, Dr. Algernon Jackson, resigns as Mercy Hospital superintendent to become director of the Howard University School of Public Health in Washington. Henry Minton takes on the job he will hold for 24 years.
So the Mintons are seen as, the founders, some of the key figures in the Black bourgeoisie, in Sigma Pi Phi, an elite African-American fraternity. And all that's true. But these were members of communities. These were citizens. They were leaders of their communities, and they were deeply involved in many aspects of the community. They raised their voice about public health disparities. They raised their voice about education inequities. They raised their voice about racial violence and the rise in lynching. They were prominent members of the NAACP, while they were also prominent members of Booker T. Washington's Negro Business League. They were members of historical societies. Someone like Edith Wormley Minton was also actively involved in the Negro Women's Associations, and in the early 1930s, she was a strong critic of the arrest of 9 boys in Scottsboro, Alabama, the famous Scottsboro Boys. And she raises money for the legal defense of these young men who were wrongly accused of attacking white women on a train in Alabama during the early years of the Great Depression.
By World War II, Sigma Pi Phi has established 25 boulets, reaching from New York to Chicago and Los Angeles. In 1954, the fraternity established 3 boulets in the months immediately after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, outlawing segregation. Sigma Pi Phi's 33 boulets now include one in Henry Minton's hometown of Columbia, South Carolina. Throughout the nation's long civil rights movement, Sigma Pi Phi's Archons take up the problems confronting the people of our race that Henry Minton envisioned in 1915. At every turn are a roll call of Archons: Benjamin Mays, Andrew Young, Ralph Bunch, John Lewis, Roy Wilkins.
In 1946, there is a meeting of a group in Columbia called the Southern Negro Youth Congress. This is a national organization, and they're holding their meeting in Columbia at one of the largest venues in our city. 2 prominent African American schools, which are also connected to Reconstruction, Allen University and Benedict College. Some of the prominent speakers at that meeting included people who would later become Archons. They also included Paul Robeson, the famous actor and civil rights champion, and the closing address was by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. During the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the young men and women from across the country, and indeed across the world, are in Columbia deliberating about the next steps to take to address white supremacy, to address discrimination at the ballot box, to address police brutality, to address the fact that many argued that World War II was about a double victory, victory abroad and victory at home. And now the war is over and people begin to see that although black people defended the nation, although black people wore the uniform, they still came home facing indignity upon indignity, discrimination upon discrimination. And so these young people are strategizing about the next steps forward. While in Columbia, in this large auditorium, they are surrounded by huge portraits of their predecessors, huge portraits of African American elected officials from the Reconstruction era, including Joseph Rainey, Robert Smalls, Robert Brown Elliott. And they're studying this history. They are embracing the history of Black Reconstruction put forward by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. So when Du Bois gives his speech called Behold the Land in the chapel of Benedict College, surrounded by over 800 students, it is a stirring address. Because here you have this aging archon, an esteemed scholar and historian, now charging these young people to pick up the mantle and to move forward. And in the Behold the Land address, Du Bois says, the future of our struggle rests with you, and the future of the struggle is in the South.
In 1963, the second Reconstruction that the students of the Southern Negro Youth Congress hoped for flames brightly. Archon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marks the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. In Henry Minton's birthplace of South Carolina, unwavering students march and sit in by the thousands. They endure fire hoses and arrests, and they win. Archon Matthew Perry argues their case before city, state, and federal courts, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He wins every one of their cases, and those cases affirm First Amendment rights for every American, bolster student protests across the South, and press Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The return to voting rights means African Americans once again represent all South Carolinians for the first time since the end of Reconstruction. An African American serves as South Carolina State Representative, Archon I.S. Levy Johnson. An African American serves as a congressman from South Carolina, Archon James Clyburn. For the first time in South Carolina history, an African American serves as a federal judge, Archon Matthew Perry. And an African American serves as the mayor of Columbia, Archon Stephen Benjamin.
And I see my role very seriously, not only as the leader of the city, but deeply defined by my presence as a Black man. Is to proudly tell the story of the ancestors, those who came before me, who laid the foundation for me and so many others to live this American life that we live. This place is is indeed a walking history to the power of Reconstruction, and I wish some days that everyone could feel the way that I feel, the power that I feel when I know of these stories and I learn more about these stories, because it tells me that if Robert Brown Elliott or Robert Smalls or DeLarge or Cardozo, if they could do what they did then, I can do anything now, and it's amazing, a powerful journey to be on. And hopefully we can all begin to appreciate our Reconstruction history a lot more.
The endeavor to locate Henry Minton's birthplace, locate the home where they live here in South Carolina, began while I was reading the history of Sigma Pi Phi authored by Charles H. Wesley. And on page 28 of that book, it states that Henry Minton, the founder of Sigma Pi Phi, was born in Columbia, South Carolina, December 25th, 1871. When I found out that he was born here, it sparked my curiosity. And I said, we need to know where that exists, where it was that they lived in Columbia, South Carolina. So I just started looking at all the city, county, state, South Carolina Department of Archives and History, the internet, any source of information that would shed light on the Minton family while in Columbia, South Carolina. I was kind of surprised when I looked at the deed. And I saw Virginia McKee Minton. Gervais and Marion Street today is a Goodyear tire dealership. And that's, so we just assumed the house had been torn down. We had given up, the house is torn down, case closed. We're gonna put a plaque there indicating that Henry Minton once lived here at this corner. But lo and behold, Archon Bobby Donaldson fired up his high-powered search engine one more time and found a newspaper article indicating that the house located at the corner of Marion Street and Gervais East had been moved 2 blocks down on Marion Street. And that house exists today at 1012 Marion Street. When we found that the house was still in existence, hadn't been torn down, had been rolled down the street, there was joy, there was excitement, there was thrill about the realization that the house still existed. After nearly 150 years, the house still existed. And there's not very many Reconstruction era homes existing in Columbia. And even fewer, there's the only one I know of that was designed by an African-American female. So this house has some very historic significance. So we feel that we're obligated to do something to preserve, to protect, and to restore this house.
The 2 Sigma Pi Phi members teamed up to have a state historical marker installed in front of the house and to have Henry Minton honored in the state's African American history calendar. The Boulets from across South Carolina hosted the National Boulay leadership for the dedication ceremony.
So Columbia, South Carolina is the home of 2 prominent figures from Reconstruction. In the city of Columbia, there is now a marker in front of the birth home of Henry McKee Minton. There's also a marker in front of the home, the boyhood home, of Woodrow Wilson. When the film Birth of a Nation is shown in 1915, it is endorsed by one native son of Columbia, Woodrow Wilson, who affirmed the claims made in Griffith's depiction of Reconstruction. And irony is another native son of Columbia named Henry Minton disputes that vigorously. And the issue of Reconstruction as a historical topic has been widely debated and challenged. And among revisionist historians of the Reconstruction period,
a stream of Archon historians work to research, represent, and honor the history and legacy of Reconstruction. Carter G. Woodson, Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, Rayford Logan, Charles Wesley.
So Henry McKee Minton, in addition to being a pioneering pharmacist, in addition to being a pioneering medical doctor, in addition to being the founder of Sigma Pi Phi, was also a gifted historian and regularly chronicled the history of the fraternity, but also chronicled the history of African-American life in this country and most notably in Philadelphia. So in 1913, he delivers a speech to the Negro Historical Society of Philadelphia. He offers some important claims about the importance and significance of Black people recording and documenting their own history. What has been done by our forefathers should be an inspiration to us and to those who shall come after us. We should not stop to count our handicaps. but should realize what were those of the men and women of the period to which we are about to retrospect. And then he says, in closing, I beg leave to say this. The facts I've given you surely should make us feel proud of the colored Philadelphians who have been here before us. They should cause us to hold up our heads and to offer no apology to anyone for being Negroes. I believe that one of the greatest functions of history is to create inspiration, to inspire us to do greater things than have been done. And bearing these things in mind, let us from this moment map out the work that lies before us.
The Mintons carried the hope and memory of Reconstruction throughout their lives. They acted on that hope and memory. Henry Minton wrote history and opposed distortions of history. He practiced medicine and trained others to combat pernicious diseases. And he built a fellowship for those excluded, a bulwark against discrimination, and for service to cities across America.
Good evening. And let me begin by saying thanks to all of you for joining our symposium as we celebrate the 150th birthday of our founder, Henry Minton, the founder of Sigma Pi Phi. It's a great day for Columbia, South Carolina. It's great to have all 5 of our memorabilia of South Carolina here present today as we celebrate Henry Minton's 150th birthday. It's also extra special to have our Southeast Regional Sire Archon Circe here with us today to help celebrate this great occasion. Earlier this year, Grand Sire Murray declared this year the year of our founder. And we thought it appropriate that we conclude this year by celebrating our founder Henry Minton's 150th birthday. 150 years ago, Theophilus Minton and his wife, Virginia McKee Minton, were anxiously awaiting the arrival of their new baby son, Henry Minton, who was born in this city, in this neighborhood, on Christmas Day of 1871. And it was 13 months later that Virginia McKee Minton, Henry Minton's mother, purchased an empty lot located at the corner of Marion Street and Gervais Street, just 2 blocks from here, and built this house where Henry Minton spent his early childhood life. And so Henry Minton was born in the middle of Reconstruction. It is these times and these events that helped shape the life of Henry Minton's early childhood development. And so we gather here today, 150 years later, to celebrate the life and legacy of this great archon, this great visionary, this great doctor and pharmacist, this great American. And we're pleased that all of you are here to help celebrate Henry Minton's 150th birthday. We're also very pleased to have with us the mayor of this great city, Archon Steve Benjamin, who will come and share with us in a Columbia-style welcome and greeting to all. And following our mayor, we'll have our Southeast Region Sire Archon Circe come and give his remarks. And he will conclude those remarks with a grand toast celebrating Henry Minton's birthday. So to all our viewers online, please get your champagne glass and get prepared to join us in this great historic toast, recognizing and celebrating Henry Minton's 150th birthday. So with that, I now introduce the mayor of this great city, the first African-American mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, Archon Steve Benjamin.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a true honor to be here with all of you today, both in person and virtually, as we've always been very proud of the role that Columbia has played in telling the story of the African seed and the American son, and particularly the role that is played in exhibiting what Black excellence means. We stand here on this hallowed ground, this historic site, as the birthplace of Henry Minton, as an example of what that vision of Sigma Pi Phi would mean for the world. We have men here who help shape this society, indeed help shape the world. So on behalf of the most grateful people of the city of Columbia, we welcome you to this historic site, this historic monument on this historic day, and historic celebration of a great man. Thank you, and Godspeed.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I am Daryl Searcy, Archon Daryl Searcy, the Regional Sire Archon, Southeast Regional Sire Archon of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. We're gathered here today in Columbia, South Carolina, in front of this historic Minton House to raise a toast in honor of the 150th birthday of the founder and past Grand Sire Archon of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, Henry McKee Minton. I want to thank the 5 member boulets from South Carolina that are here today to celebrate with us. I'd also like to thank the Center for Civil Rights History and Research of the University of South Carolina, in conjunction with the virtual symposium on the life and times of Archon Henry Minton, for this wonderful, wonderful celebration. And now I invite you all to raise a glass in honor of Archon Henry Minton. By doing so, we mark accomplishments of the past and also look forward to a bright future and growth and prosperity. To founding Archon Henry Minton, hear, hear.
Good evening and well done, Southeast Regional Sire Searcy. You are correct that this celebration honoring Founder Minton marks the accomplishments of the past, and it truly allows us to look forward to a bright future of growth and posterity. But as Grand Sire Archon of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, I would like to take this opportunity to again thank everyone for joining me for this remarkable retrospective about Henry McKee Minton and his incredible journey, a journey that began during Reconstruction 150 years ago on December 25th, 1871 in Columbia, South Carolina. I would like to extend my thanks and congratulations to all 5 member boulets of South Carolina and the University of South Carolina's Center for Civil Rights, History, and Research for developing and producing this outstanding documentary. Thanks as well to all of the Archons and scholars who participated in this virtual symposium, especially Archon James E. Clyburn, Congressman of the 6th District of South Carolina and Majority Whip of the U.S. House of Representatives, and Archon Rodney J. Reed, the Grand Historian of Sigma Pi Phi. As a founder and the original Grand Sire Archon of Sigma Pi Phi, Archon Minton lived a remarkable and full life, one that holds up a mirror to the history of African Americans and the country. As you have learned in this documentary, he and his family lived only blocks from the South Carolina State House, where an impressive group of African American men and women played a critical role in the reconstruction of our nation. And as you just saw in our toast, we are fortunate that the Minton home still stands near the University of South Carolina. And for the past 117 years, the members of Sigma Pi Phi have worked to build a close, sacred fraternal union and to follow Archon Minton's brilliant example. And that is why we have adopted vision, leadership, and action during changing times as our biennial theme. As Sigma Pi Phi's Grand Sire Archon, I encourage further research, documentation, and education focus on our founders of our fraternity and the Reconstruction era of our nation's history. Again, I would like to commend Alpha Iota Boule and the 4 other member Boules of South Carolina, Gamma Lambda Boule, Delta Beta Boule, Delta Chi Boule, and Epsilon Mu Boule, and the Center for Civil Rights History and Research for this excellent production. Thank you for being with us, and good evening.